Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Science Nerd. Tonight, let's take a slow walk into a world that feels both familiar and completely alien. Don't worry, you won't need snow boots, but you might want a blanket because we're going back to the Ice Age. And no, not the animated movie with a talking sloth and a squirrel chasing an acorn, though I admit that squirrel is still my spirit animal. I'm talking about the real Ice Age, the one that lasted millions of years and shaped the earth we live on today. Wait, before we jump into this thrilling story, make sure to give this video a like and hit that subscribe button. It really helps me stay motivated to create even better content. Now let's dive into this series and see what it's all about. Thanks you. So picture this. You're standing somewhere that will one day become North America or maybe Northern Europe. But right now, forget cities, highways, or Wi-Fi signals. The horizon isn't filled with skyscrapers. It's filled with a wall of ice. Massive glaciers rise hundreds of meters high, stretching as far as your eyes can see. The air is razor sharp, dry, and heavy with the scent of snow. It feels like winter has called dibs on the planet and refuses to leave. But here's the thing. The Ice Age wasn't just one long freeze like some eternal snow day. It was more like Earth's version of mood swings, a back and forth cycle between colder glacial periods and warmer interglacials. Imagine Mother Earth hitting the cosmic thermostat, cold, warm, over and over again. These swings happened because of tiny shifts in the way our planet orbits. The sun tilts on its axis and wobbles like a spinning top that's had one too many espressos. On their own, those changes sound like no big deal. But over tens of thousands of years, they reshaped entire continents. Now, before we drown in the science, let's take a second to imagine what this world felt like. Despite the bitter cold, it wasn't lifeless. Herds of woolly mammoths roamed the plains, their curved tusks glinting in pale sunlight. Saber-toothed cats crouched low in the grass, their oversized teeth catching the light like ivory knives. Farther south, where the ice never reached rivers, flowed through green forests, and tucked into those warmer pockets where our ancestors, early humans, wrapped in furs, gathered around fires, not knowing they were living through what we now call the Ice Age. For them, it wasn't an era of global climate transformation. It was just life. Wake up, hunt, eat, try not to get eaten. Simple priorities. Here's something wild. The Ice Age didn't just sculpt the land, it also sculpted us. As glaciers advanced, they didn't politely knock on the door. They bulldozed mountains, carved valleys, and shoved boulders around like toys. Even today, if you've ever visited Canada, Scandinavia, or the northern United States, you've seen the scars, U-shaped valleys, rocky deposits, and lakes that were once gouged out by moving ice. In a sense, glaciers were the original interior decorators of the planet, except their style was minimalist destruction. But let's zoom out. One of the coolest parts about the Ice Age is how it changed the map of Earth. When so much water froze into ice sheets, sea levels dropped by more than 300 feet. That means whole chunks of land appeared out of the ocean. Imagine walking from Asia straight into North America across a giant frozen land bridge we now call Beringia. To the people and animals at the time, it wasn't Beringia. It was just land, a windy, snowy highway where mammoth, wolves, and humans all shuffled along, trying not to freeze their toes off. That land bridge, changed everything. It allowed humans to spread into new continents, setting the stage for future civilizations. Still, let's not pretend life was cozy. Survival here was a full-time job. Imagine you're one of those early humans. No grocery store, no delivery apps. If you're hungry, you grab a spear, gather your crew, and go find a mammoth. The hunt might take days, and even if you succeed, you now have to deal with saber-tooths who would love to take your kill. Honestly, if you think rush hour traffic is stressful, try keeping your dinner away from a 600-pound cat with teeth like steak knives. But the Ice Age wasn't only about danger, it was also about balance. For all its brutality, life adapted. Plants hugged the ground, stubborn little grasses pushing through snow whenever summer gave them a brief chance. Rodents dug tunnels beneath the frost, creating hidden worlds where they stayed warmer than above. Birds learned to migrate. Foxes changed their coats from brown to white to blend with the seasons, and mammoths wore shaggy wool coats long before it was a fashion trend. Humans adapted too. They used mammoth bones to frame shelters, stitched furs into clothing, and discovered that fire was more than warmth. It was survival protection, and maybe even a reason to tell stories. Around those fires, they painted cave walls with animals they hunted, leaving behind art that still speaks to us thousands of years later. It's almost like they were saying, yes, we froze our butts off, but we also made time to doodle. Now, here's a paradox. While the northern continents froze, the equator still stayed warm. Jungles existed, deserts existed. Life didn't vanish. It shifted, moved, and found ways to endure. The Ice Age wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was a world of sharp contrasts. That's what makes it so fascinating. At the same moment, a glacier was grinding across Canada. Tropical forests in Africa were buzzing with life. And through it all, Earth breathed. Slowly, glaciers crept forward like armies, then retreated when the climate warmed. This wasn't something you'd notice in your lifetime. You could live and die in the shadow of a glacier without seeing it move an inch. That's the weirdness of deep time. It's both invisible and unstoppable. The changes were gradual, but the results were massive. Entire landscapes, transformed oceans, redrawn species born and extinct. So let's pause. Imagine standing at the edge of one of those glaciers. The sky is pale, the air heavy. You don't hear much, just the faint groan of ice shifting, the occasional crack echoing across the horizon. It's not dramatic like a thunderstorm. It's quieter, heavier, the kind of sound that makes you realize the world is bigger than you can imagine. That's the Ice Age, not a frozen prison, but a sculptor, a teacher, and in its own way, a beginning. Because here's the thing, without the Ice Age, the world we live in today wouldn't exist. Our rivers, valleys, and fertile soils, all of them, are gifts of those glaciers. Even our own species carries echoes of that frozen era in our migrations, our stories, and our resilience. The Ice Age is gone, but its fingerprints are still everywhere. And if you stand outside on a sharp winter night when the air bites and the world is quiet, you can almost feel it. A memory older than history, whispering through the cold. So bundle up, we're just getting started. The Ice Age has a lot more to show us, and trust me, it gets even wilder from here. The glaciers didn't just sit there like giant frozen statues. They were alive in their own slow motion kind of way. Inch by inch, they crept across the land, and wherever they moved, they left marks that are still visible today. If mountains had diaries, they'd probably have whole chapters complaining about how much glaciers bullied them. These ice sheets were enormous. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet covered almost all of Canada and reached deep into the United States. Over in Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet stretched across Scandinavia and pressed southward, carving its way into the continent. Even in the southern hemisphere highlands of South America and New Zealand wore icy crowns. To call these glaciers big is like calling the ocean a little damp. They were massive walls of frozen power, and they didn't move politely. As they advanced, glaciers scraped forests from the ground, flattened hills, and dragged boulders across the land like children dragging toys. If you've ever walked through a wide valley with steep walls and a flat bottom, that's the signature of a glacier. Rivers carve V-shaped valleys. Glaciers carve U-shaped ones. Easy to remember V for very fast rivers, U for unbelievably slow ice. But glaciers weren't only destructive. In their wake, they left behind a new world. They gouged basins that filled with water, giving us thousands of lakes across Canada, Scandinavia, and the northern United States. The Great Lakes, those enormous freshwater seas, are perhaps the most famous gift glaciers left behind. So yes, you can thank an ice sheet next time you're enjoying a boat ride on Lake Michigan. Then there were the so-called glacial erratics. Imagine a massive boulder sitting in the middle of a field where no mountain exists for miles. It looks out of place, like someone dropped it there from a helicopter. In reality, glaciers did the heavy lifting, carrying these rocks for hundreds of miles before dumping them when the ice melted. Farmers used to scratch their heads at them, but geologists now recognize them as proof of the glacier's slow but unstoppable delivery service. The weight of these glaciers was so crushing that the Earth's crust literally bent under them. Picture pushing your hand into a memory foam mattress. That's what the ice did to entire continents. And when the glaciers melted, the land began to spring back up, slowly, so slowly that northern Europe and Canada are still rising today, like someone finally stood up from a chair after sitting there for thousands of years. Now, while the land was being squashed, the oceans were shrinking. With so much water trapped in ice, sea levels dropped by more than 300 feet. That's like draining an entire ocean into a giant freezer. The result, new lands appeared. The most famous was the land bridge between Asia and North America, Beringia. To the animals and people crossing it, it wasn't some mysterious bridge. It was just land, a vast, cold, wind-swept plain where mammoths, caribou, wolves, and small bands of humans trudged along, probably wondering if they'd ever find a warmer spot to nap. Other hidden lands showed up too. Doggerland connected Britain to Europe. Sunderland turned the scattered islands of Southeast Asia into one massive continent. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania fused together into a single landmass. It was like Earth was constantly updating its map, confusing anyone who tried to keep track. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing your island is suddenly part of a super-sized neighborhood. No wonder migration stories spread so far. But glaciers weren't always slow and steady. Sometimes they melted with a bang. Beneath the ice, giant lakes built up, trapped behind frozen walls. And when those walls broke, floods so massive, they ripped across continents, carving valleys in days. One of the largest glacial lake agencies once covered more area than all the modern Great Lakes combined. When it drained, it unleashed torrents of water that reshape rivers and even nudge the climate off balance. If you were an early human camped nearby one day, you'd have a nice lakeside view, and the next day, your entire valley would be underwater. That'll ruin a cookout real fast. These mega floods dumped enormous amounts of fresh water into the oceans, disrupting currents that carried heat around the globe. Temperatures shifted, winds changed, and the ripple effects reached far beyond the places where the floods began. It's a reminder that what glaciers did in one region could echo across the entire planet, like a domino effect, but with ice cubes the size of continents. And then there was the dust. The Ice Age wasn't just cold, it was dusty. As glaciers scraped across bedrock, they ground it into powder. Winds swept that fine dust across continents, blanketing huge areas with layers of fertile soil. Some of the richest farmland in modern China, Europe, and North America comes from this Ice Age dust. So yes, glaciers may have trashed the place, but they also left behind some pretty good farmland. A messy roommate who destroys your furniture but stocks your pantry. The strangest part of all this is the time scale. Glaciers rarely moved more than a few feet per day. You could live your entire life in the shadow of a glacier and never see it budge. And yet, over thousands of years, they shaped valleys, sculpted coastlines, and built the foundations of future civilizations. It's like watching paint dry, except that paint eventually rewrites the entire map of Earth. Now imagine standing near one of those glaciers. The air is biting cold. The wall of ice looms in front of you, taller than any building. Blue cracks streak across its face, and trickles of meltwater carve tiny streams down its sides. Every so often, you hear a deep groan as the ice shifts, like the earth itself, letting out a sigh. To the people and animals of the time, glaciers weren't just scenery, they were boundaries. You couldn't cross them. You could only move alongside them, setting up camp where the land was still free. But here's the twist. Glaciers weren't only barriers. They also created opportunities. When they retreated, they revealed fresh land bare, but rich with new soil. Plants quickly colonized, animals followed, and humans weren't far behind. Entire communities sprouted in areas that had been buried under ice for thousands of years. It was like the glaciers gave back what they had taken, just in a completely new form. This balance between destruction and renewal was the heart of the Ice Age. Glaciers crushed, scraped, and flooded, but they also carved valleys, created lakes, dropped fertile dust, and opened new lands. They were Earth's chisels, sculpting a planet that was constantly changing, constantly reshaping itself. And here's the part that sticks with me. We can still see their work today. The Great Lakes, U-shaped valleys, scattered boulders in odd places, fertile soils that feed millions. They're not just pretty landscapes or farming gold mines. They're signatures left by ice, proof that the world we live in now is built on the back of a frozen past. So the next time you stand at the edge of a wide valley or see a lonely boulder sitting in the middle of a field, remember that's the Ice Age, waving hello. A reminder that the land beneath our feet is a canvas that glaciers once carved with patience, persistence, and a whole lot of ice. When people picture the Ice Age, they usually imagine endless sheets of white, a frozen desert where nothing moves. But that's only half the story. The truth is, much of the Ice Age world was alive with motion. It wasn't just ice, it was grass herds, predators, and eventually people. And at the heart of it all stretched a vast windswept ecosystem known as the Mammoth Steppe. This was no ordinary grassland. It was the largest biome on Earth during the Ice Age, stretching from Western Europe across Siberia and all the way into North America. Picture a continuous open plain so huge it makes the Great Plains of the United States look like a backyard garden. Cold winds whipped across its. Summers were short. Winters were brutal, but for all its harshness, it was packed with life. In fact, some scientists argue it was the most productive ecosystem the planet has ever seen. Not bad for a place where snow was a permanent fashion accessory. So what made this steppe so special? The grass. Ice Age grasses were hardy, nutrient-rich, and spread across the land like an all-you-can-eat buffet. They didn't waste time growing tall like modern trees. Instead, they stayed low to the ground, clinging tight against the wind, stubborn and efficient. These grasses fed the giants, and the giants, in turn, fed everything else. Let's start with the celebrities of the Ice Age, the woolly mammoths, shaggy, colossal, with curved tusks that could sweep the snow aside like nature's snowplows. They marched across the plains in herds of dozens, sometimes hundreds. Imagine watching a line of them stretching to the horizon, each step pressing deep into the frozen ground. These weren't rare, exotic animals. They were everywhere. For humans, they were danger opportunity and Home Depot all rolled into one. Mammoth bones, built shelters hides, became clothing meat, filled bellies for weeks. Without mammoths, survival would have been a lot harder. Of course, the mammoths probably had a different opinion about this arrangement. They weren't alone. Their slightly stockier cousins, the mastodons, preferred forests at the edges of the steppe. Their straighter tusks and shorter legs suited them for stripping bark and tearing branches. Then there were woolly rhinoceroses, giant shaggy tanks with long horns stomping through the snow to push it aside. Bison roamed in massive herds, muskoxen clustered together in defensive circles when danger approached, and reindeer migrated in endless lines, their hooves clattering across frozen ground. Even wild horses, smaller and sturdier than today's breeds, galloped across the steppe in tightly knit bands. Where you find prey, you'll always find predators. The mammoth steppe was no exception. Dire wolves prowled the herds, larger and heavier than modern wolves, their jaws strong enough to crush bone. Cave lions, nearly twice the size of today's African lions, hunted in coordinated groups, their golden coats blending into the pale light of the grasslands. And then there were the saber-toothed cats, with shoulders built like bodybuilders and teeth like ivory daggers. They didn't chase down prey, they ambushed it. Imagine crouching in the grass while a herd of bison passes, then leaping out with fangs that look like they belong in a fantasy novel. If you were a small Ice Age herbivore, that was basically your nightmare scenario. And towering over all this, and quite literally, were the glaciers. Their walls of ice loomed on the horizon, blue cracks gleaming, deep groans echoing as they shifted. Life didn't dare live on the glaciers, but in their shadows, the steppe flourished. The animals had adapted perfectly to this cold, dry world. Mammoths had shaggy coats with an insulating underlayer of fine wool, plus blood adapted to keep their limbs warm, even in brutal wind chill. Muskoxen wore pelts so dense that snow could sit on their backs without melting. Predators grew thicker, fur, broader paws, and muscles tuned for power in deep snow. Evolution had given them all survival gear that would put modern winter jackets to shame. But the Ice Age wasn't just about fur and tusks. Beneath the snow, a hidden world thrived. Rodents like lemmings and voles dug networks of burrows, carving out tiny underground cities. Down there, the air stayed warmer, stable, protected from the raging winds above. These small creatures were the base of the food chain, feeding owls, foxes, and just about everything with teeth sharp enough to grab them. Birds, like the snowy owl, patrolled the tundra year-round, swooping down on unsuspecting lemmings. Even insects had tricks. Some produced natural antifreeze proteins that kept their bodies from freezing solid. Yes, even bugs had survival strategies. This constant dance of survival created a balance. Life didn't conquer the cold, it adapted to it. Every species bent to the harshness without breaking, finding its niche in an environment that demanded everything and gave very little back. And somehow, that balance made the mammoth steppe one of the richest ecosystems ever. Of course, humans eventually walked onto this stage too. Small groups of hunters followed the herds armed with stone-tipped spears and wrapped in furs. They learned the patterns of migration, tracked the movements of bison and mammoth, and set up camps in places where rivers cut through the plains. They weren't dominant yet, not by a long shot. At night, the glow of their fires was just one more light among the eyes of wolves, the shadows of lions, and the stars above. But slowly, patiently, they were learning. And as they learned, they became part of the balance. Now imagine standing in the middle of this world. The horizon stretches endlessly in every direction. The wind sweeps across the plains, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves, the low rumble of herds moving together. A line of mammoths marches past, shaggy hair, swaying tusks gleaming. Bison graze nearby, steam rising from their bodies in the cold air. In the distance, wolves follow, patient and watchful. Overhead, ravens circle, waiting for the scraps that will eventually appear. It's not silent, it's alive. A chorus of survival where every creature, from the smallest rodent tunneling under the snow to the largest mammoth casting a shadow across the steppe, is playing its part. But this world, for all its richness, wasn't permanent. The mammoth steppe depended on the cold. Its grasses thrived in the dry, frozen soil. But as soon as the climate warmed and forests crept northward, the balance shifted. Slowly at first, then faster, the vast grasslands shrank. The herds that once covered continents were squeezed into smaller and smaller ranges. And with them, the predators who depended on them began to disappear. Still, for tens of thousands of years, the mammoth steppe was the beating heart of the Ice Age. It was where the giants ruled, where predators hunted, and where humans learned some of the skills that would carry them through the millennia. Standing there would have been overwhelming, raw, vast, and untamed. And yet it was home. Home to giants, hunters, scavengers, and everything in between. A world that demanded resilience and rewarded it with survival. And maybe that's the real secret of the Ice Age. Not just the cold, not just the glaciers, but the way life, big and small, found ways to endure. Every hoofprint in the snow, every tunnel beneath the frost, every fire burning against the wind was a reminder. Even in the harshest world imaginable, life finds a way. The Ice Age was not one endless freeze. That's the first thing to clear up. Yes, glaciers dominated vast regions, and yes, mammoths stomped across snowy plains. But the truth is more complicated. The planet didn't just press pause on warmth for millions of years. Instead, it followed a rhythm, a slow breath of cold glacial periods and warmer intervals in between. These shifts shaped every mountain, every forest, every migration. To really understand the Ice Age, you have to hear the rhythm of the Earth itself. So, what drove this icy dance? Surprisingly, it wasn't one big switch being flipped. It was small, subtle changes in the way Earth moves around the sun. The shape of our orbit stretches and relaxes like a rubber band. The tilt of our axis leans a little more, then a little less. Even the planet wobbles like a spinning top that's not perfectly balanced. On a human scale, these shifts are invisible. You wouldn't notice the sun looking any different in the sky. But over tens of thousands of years, they changed how much sunlight reached the northern parts of the world. And that made all the difference. When the tilt was smaller, summers in the north were cooler. Snow that fell in winter didn't melt completely, and layer after layer piled up until glaciers grew. When the tilt increased, summers got stronger, melting more snow, shrinking the ice. This pattern, slow but relentless, turned the planet from icy to less icy and back again, like a pendulum swinging across time. It wasn't fast. You could live your whole life and never notice a thing, but give it a few thousand years, and suddenly the world looked very different. Of course, the Earth isn't a simple machine. Climate isn't just one button you push. When glaciers expanded, they reflected more sunlight back into space, which cooled the planet even further. Colder oceans absorbed more carbon dioxide, lowering greenhouse gases and making the air even chillier. That made glaciers grow faster, which made the planet reflect more sunlight, a feedback loop that kept pushing things toward cold. When the ice retreated, the opposite happened. Land and water absorbed more heat. Oceans released carbon dioxide, and warmth spread again. It was a long, patient tug of war between ice and fire. And then sometimes the rhythm stuttered. In the middle of these grand cycles, sudden jolts arrived. Massive volcanic eruptions filled the sky with ash, dimming the sunlight and cooling the air for years at a time. Ocean currents shifted like giant conveyor belts gone rogue, redistributing heat in strange ways. Even the glaciers themselves sometimes caused chaos, when giant meltwater lakes suddenly burst and sent floods surging across continents. Each jolt was like the Earth skipping a beat brief compared to the sweep of millennia, but powerful enough to change ecosystems in an instant. Imagine living through one of these shifts. For animals on the mammoth steppe, it meant moving south when the cold bit deeper, then drifting north again when the warmth returned. Herds of bison mammoths and reindeer followed the grass as it appeared and disappeared. Predators shadowed them, adjusting their hunts, and humans, small groups of hunters, learned to read the signs in the land. A dry riverbed meant the herds had moved on. A change in the plants meant new grazing grounds were opening. Survival depended on paying attention to the slow conversation between earth and sky. The glaciers themselves recorded these swings in frozen detail. Each layer of snow that fell trapped tiny bubbles of air. Over thousands of years, those layers stacked up like pages in a book. Today, scientists drill deep into ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland, pulling out cylinders of ancient snow. Inside them are whispers of the past bubbles of air that tell us what the atmosphere was like hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's like having a time capsule of Earth's breath. From those ice cores, we know the Ice Age wasn't one long freeze, but a series of advances and retreats each one carving flooding and remaking the land. But you don't need to be a scientist with a giant drill to see the evidence. The valleys carved into mountains, the boulders scattered across fields, the rich dust soils of the Midwest and China. They're all the echoes of this rhythm. Walk through them, and you're literally stepping on history shaped by ice that crept forward and backward in a dance far older than any human memory. Now here's where it gets wild. Even at the coldest point of the Ice Age, the world wasn't entirely frozen. The equator still held jungles. Deserts stretched across Africa and Australia. Rivers still ran. Forests still grew in warmer regions. And life adapted to every corner. That's the paradox. The Ice Age wasn't a single global freezer. It was contrast. Frozen walls of ice in the north, while far to the south, trees swayed in warm winds. The planet wasn't dead. It was just very different. Think about how strange that must have felt for the first humans. If you lived near the equator, you might never even realize the Ice Age was happening. The nights were warm, the forests green. But if you lived farther north, glaciers towered over your world, and survival meant fire's furs and constant movement. The Ice Age wasn't one experience. It was many depending on where you stood. And perhaps that's why the story of the Ice Age still fascinates us. It's not just about cold, it's about change. A reminder that the earth doesn't stand still, even when it feels eternal. To a person living thousands of years ago, nothing seemed different from one year to the next. But step back, zoom out, and you see a world breathing in ice and exhaling warmth. A slow, patient rhythm, steady enough to shape continents, powerful enough to shape us. So the Ice Age was never one single chapter. It was a series of verses, repeating, overlapping, sometimes stumbling, but always moving forward. Each swing of that pendulum wrote itself into stone soil and memory. And if you listen closely to the groan of ancient glaciers, to the fossils in the ground, even to the shape of the valleys around you, you can still hear it, the slow heartbeat of a planet breathing through ice and fire. The Ice Age was not only about giant herds and woolly beasts peacefully grazing across the mammoth steppe. For every mammoth or bison trudging through the snow, there were sharp eyes, watching paws, waiting, and muscles coiled to strike. This frozen world was as much about predators as it was about prey. And if you were alive, then whether mammoth, horse, or human, you learned very quickly that survival meant knowing who was lurking in the shadows. Let's start with the poster child of Ice Age, Danger the saber-toothed cat. Those enormous curved fangs are so famous that they've become symbols of the entire era. But don't let the name fool you. These cats weren't racing around like cheetahs. Their legs were short, their bodies heavy, their necks built thick to support those massive teeth. They were ambush hunters. Imagine crouching low in the grass, waiting for a young bison or mammoth calf to wander too close. Then, in a blur, they'd leap-sink those saber teeth deep and bring the prey down before it even knew what happened. If you've ever stepped on a Lego in the dark, multiply that by about 1,000,000. That's how it felt to be their prey. But the saber-tooth wasn't the only heavyweight champion out there. Cave lions, nearly twice the size of modern lions, roamed the mammoth steppe. Unlike the saber-tooth loners, these big cats likely hunted in groups. Picture 6 or 7 lions spreading out across the snow, silent golden shadows blending into the pale light. Together, they could challenge even mammoths. They weren't just hunters, they were strategists. And then came the dire wolves, larger, stronger, and heavier than modern wolves. Their jaws could crush bone with ease. They didn't work alone either. They worked in packs, often trailing the big herds for days, waiting for a moment of weakness. Imagine the sound of their howls rolling across the icy plains, echoing through the night. For humans, huddled in their fur shelters, that sound wasn't just eerie, it was a warning that the world outside the firelight belonged to others. Predators came in all sizes. Wolverines, small but terrifyingly fierce, could drive larger animals away from carcasses. Foxes darted at the edges of hunts, snatching scraps when no one was looking. Overhead, vultures and ravens circled patient opportunists, waiting for the snow to stain red. The Ice Age food chain didn't waste a single bite. If something fell, someone, be it lion, wolf, fox, or bird, was going to eat it. Now imagine what this meant for humans. Early hunters weren't apex predators at the top of the pyramid. They were participants in the game. When a group of humans tracked a herd of bison, they sometimes found themselves competing with wolves on the same trail. If they tried to scavenge a carcass, there might already be a saber-toothed chewing on it. Survival wasn't just about hunting. It was about nerve, knowing when to fight, when to retreat, and when to wait until the big cats were done before sneaking in for leftovers. This constant pressure shaped how humans lived. They traveled in groups for safety. They kept their fires burning, not just for warmth, but as glowing warnings to keep predators at bay. The circle of firelight was a fragile boundary between survival and disaster. Outside it, wolves prowled and lions waited. Inside it, there was warmth, food, and the fragile comfort of voices telling stories in the night. And here's the twist: predators were teachers as much as threats. Competing with saber-tooths and dire wolves forced humans to become smarter hunters. They learned cooperation, timing, and strategy. Alone, one person stood no chance. Together with spears and fire, they became rivals even the fiercest predators respected. Slowly, humans moved from occasional prey to competitor. It wasn't dominance yet, but it was the beginning of something new. Still, let's not sugarcoat it. The Ice Age was dangerous. A single misstep on a hunt could turn the hunter into the hunted. Imagine chasing a bison only to realize too late that a pack of dire wolves had been following you instead. Or walking into a snowy clearing, unaware that a saber-tooth was crouched in the shrubs. Life demanded constant awareness. You couldn't zone out like someone scrolling on their phone today. Every sound, every shadow, every gust of wind might mean danger. And yet this dangerous world was balanced. Predators weren't villains. They were part of the system. Without them, herds would have grown too large, grasses would have been stripped bare, and the ecosystem would have collapsed. They kept the rhythm of life steady. The mammoths moved, the wolves followed, the humans adapted. Everyone had their role in the icy drama. Picture the scene. A mammoth herd moves slowly across the snowy plain. At the edges, wolves follow, patient and silent. In the grass, a saber-tooth waits, eyes locked on a calf that strays too far from its mother. High above, ravens circle, already anticipating a feast. And in the distance, a small band of humans watches, spears in hand, waiting for their chance. This was the Ice Age stage, where every move mattered, every risk carried both danger and reward. It's tempting to think of ourselves as separate from that world, but in truth, we were shaped by it. Our ancestors sharpened their wits against predators, just as much as against the cold. They learned to cooperate because lions and wolves forced them to. They built better tools because survival demanded it. In the glow of firelight, they told stories not just of hunts, but of the creatures that shared the land, the rivals, the dangers, the teachers in the shadows. And maybe that's the lasting lesson of Ice Age predators. They remind us that survival wasn't about conquering the land. It was about coexisting with it, respecting it, and adapting to its rules. Even dire wolves and saber-toothed, for all their power, eventually vanished when the balance shifted. Life on the steppe was never guaranteed. It was earned every single day in the long dance between prey predator and the people caught in between. The Ice Age wasn't only a time of glaciers and predators hiding in the grass. It was also the age of giant animals, so massive that standing beside them would make even the tallest human feel like a toddler. Size itself became a survival strategy, a way to endure the cold winds and endless winters. To walk through that world was to feel small, no matter who or what you were. Take the woolly mammoth. We've talked about them before, but let's pause and really picture them. Towering over the tundra, covered in shaggy coats with tusks that could stretch longer than a car. They weren't just big, they were monumental. Imagine a herd of them marching across the snow in long, patient lines. Their footsteps pressed deep into the frozen soil, leaving trails that could last for weeks. These weren't scattered, lonely creatures. They moved in groups sometimes, by the dozens or even hundreds, and everywhere they went, they reshaped the land, digging through snow for grass stripping bark from trees and creating pathways that other animals followed. Beside them were the mastodons, cousins of the mammoth. Shorter, stockier, and preferring forested areas, they weren't as famous, but they were just as impressive. Their tusks were straighter, their habits more focused on tearing bark and branches than sweeping snow. Where mammoths ruled the open plains, mastodons carved out lives in the cold woodlands. And then came the woolly rhinoceroses. Imagine a furry tank stomping through the snow with a horn long enough to double as a medieval lance. They used those horns to push aside snow in search of food or to defend themselves against predators, bold or foolish enough to approach. Alongside them grazed bison larger than modern cattle, muskoxen, forming tight circles when threatened, and wild horses stockier than today's breeds, galloping in herds across the steppe. But the giants weren't limited to the north. Farther south, ground sloths the size of small cars lumbered through the Americas. Their claws could dig roots or tear branches down from trees. And if you thought bears today are scary, meet the short-faced bear. Taller than any living bear, with long legs built for speed, it was a predator that could chase down prey across open grasslands. Imagine trying to outrun a bear that not only towers over you, but also runs faster than your high school track team. Good luck with that. Australia had its own caste of giants. Kangaroos that stood taller than basketball players, marsupial lions that stalked prey with sharp claws, and enormous flightless birds, heavier than ostriches. Even the rivers and swamps weren't safe, with crocodile-like reptiles carrying on their ancient business jaws, snapping shut with a sound that meant game over. The oceans, too, carried their share of giants. Along the coasts, as sea levels dropped, new feeding grounds opened up. Marine mammals thrived. The enormous Steller's sea cow, a relative of the manatee, grazed in shallow waters on kelp beds growing to lengths of 30 feet or more. They were gentle, slow, and sadly easy targets for humans when we eventually found them. Out in deeper waters, sharks prowled their presence, reminding every creature that the sea, like the land, was no safe place. So why so many giants? In a word, survival. Being big helped. Large bodies lose heat more slowly, giving mammoths and rhinos an advantage in the brutal cold. Their size also let them travel long distances to find food. And in a world where predators like saber-toothed and dire wolves lurked, being enormous was often the best defense. You didn't need speed when your sheer bulk made most hunters think twice. But size came with risks. Giants needed enormous amounts of food. A single mammoth could eat hundreds of pounds of vegetation in a day. A herd moving together stripped grasslands bare, quickly forcing them to keep moving. For predators, hunting something that big was dangerous. A mammoth defending its calf could crush a saber-tooth or gore a wolf with a single strike. Hunting giants was possible, but it wasn't easy. Even humans with spears and fire had to cooperate carefully or risk being trampled in an instant. What's striking isn't just how big these animals were, but how many of them there were. The mammoth steppe was one of the most densely packed ecosystems ever. Herds stretched across horizons, predators followed in abundance, and scavengers picked clean whatever was left behind. It wasn't just a world of giants, it was a world of numbers, where life filled every possible niche. Now picture yourself on a ridge, looking down at this frozen parade. Mammoths march in slow, steady lines, their tusks glowing in the pale sunlight. Bison move, in clusters, the air alive with the sound of hooves. Wild horses gallop across the plains, steam rising from their bodies in the cold air. In the distance, a short-faced bear lumbers forward, sniffing the wind, while vultures circles overhead, waiting for their chance. It's overwhelming, a living ocean of fur tusks and movement. And in the middle of it all, humans were there too. Small bands of hunters watched these giants learning their habits, testing their skills against prey far larger than themselves. To bring down a mammoth wasn't just a hunt, it was an event. Success meant food shelter tools and clothing for weeks. Failure meant hunger and risk. Humans respected these giants because their lives depended on them. The giants shaped not just the land, but the people who lived alongside them. Our ancestors carved mammoths into cave walls, made figurines out of ivory, and told stories around fires about the creatures they hunted. These animals weren't just food, they were woven into the culture, the imagination, the identity of Ice Age people. And yet, for all their power, the giants were vulnerable. When the climate shifted and the steppe began to shrink, their world narrowed. The grasses that had sustained them gave way to forests. Migration paths were cut off. And as humans spread farther with sharper tools and more sophisticated hunting methods, the giants found themselves caught in a squeeze. Too big to adapt quickly, too dependent on vast open plains, many of them eventually faded into memory. But in their time, they were rulers of the earth. The Ice Age wasn't just cold, it was colossal. To walk through it was to share space with beings so massive, they made the ground shake when they moved. The giants remind us of a world where survival favored size, strength, and resilience. A world so different from ours that it feels almost mythical, yet it was real. And traces of it remain in bones, pulled from frozen ground, in paintings deep inside caves, and in the very land itself still marked by the footsteps of giants long gone. By now, you might be picturing the Ice Age as a giant wildlife documentary, mammoths, marching predators, lurking glaciers looming. But there's another actor on this frozen stage: humans. Small, fragile, compared to the beasts around them, yet somehow able to carve out a place in a world that seemed designed to push them back. How did they do it? The answer comes down to three things: fire, fur, and a lot of clever thinking. Let's start with fire. To us today, fire is comfort, a campfire, while camping may be a scented candle at home. But in the Ice Age, fire was survival. It wasn't optional. Without it, the cold could kill in hours. Around the glow of flames, families huddled close, their furs pulled tight, hands stretched to the warmth. Fire meant safety food and hope. It cooked meat so it could be chewed and stored. It hardened spear tips, making weapons deadlier. It kept wolves and lions at bay when the dark pressed in. A single spark could mean the difference between life and death. And fire wasn't just borrowed from lightning or volcanoes anymore. By the height of the Ice Age, humans had learned how to make it, striking flint against pyrite, coaxing sparks into tinder, blowing gently until a flame appeared. It was skill, patience, and maybe a bit of magic. For the first time, humans weren't just keeping fire alive, they owned it. That ownership changed everything. Then there was fur. Humans didn't exactly come equipped for sub-zero weather. Compared to a muskox or a mammoth, we're practically naked. The solution: borrow fur. Early humans stitched together hides with bone needles, layering them into coats, boots, and hoods. A good set of furs could keep the cold out even in the harshest winds. Some garments were so effective that snow could settle on a person's shoulders without melting, just like on a muskox's back. Fashion may not have been the goal, but practicality never goes out of style. If runway shows existed back then, the models would have been wrapped in mammoth hide, stomping dramatically down the icy tundra. Shelters, too, were masterpieces of adaptation. In treeless regions where wood was scarce, people turned to bones. Mammoth ribs and tusks formed the frames of huts covered with hides for insulation. Inside, cramped but warm, smoke rising through a hole in the roof, families lived and dreamed. Imagine a small circle of huts glowing faintly in the dark, the wind howling outside, but the fire crackling within. These weren't palaces, but they were fortresses against the cold. And then there were tools. Humans shaped stone into scrapers' blades and spear points. They carved bone and antler into hooks and needles. Each tool was born of necessity, refined through trial and error, then passed down through generations. Hunting wasn't a solo act. It required cooperation. Small groups tracked herds together, driving animals into traps or ambushes. A single successful hunt could feed dozens. A failed hunt meant hunger, maybe worse. Risk was constant, but so was determination. Yet even in this world of survival, humans found time for creativity. In caves across Europe and Asia, they painted. Mammoths, bison, horses, and reindeer danced across walls in red and black ochre. Some paintings were simple outlines. Others captured movement and muscle with astonishing detail. Handprints pressed against stone still remain, as if the artists were reaching across time to say, "We were here. We saw this world. Remember us?" No one knows exactly why they painted ritual teaching or simple expression, but what's clear is that even in the shadow of glaciers, humans carried imagination. They carved figurines too, Small sculptures of animals or of people like the famous Venus figurines, rounded, stylized representations of the human form. Their purpose remains debated: fertility symbols, spiritual icons, or just Ice Age art projects. Whatever their meaning, they prove that humans weren't just scraping by. They were thinking, creating, imagining. Stories filled the nights as much as fire did. Around flames, voices rose and fell, telling tales of hunts of spirits of the strange and immense world outside. These stories weren't entertainment alone. They were survival manuals, passing knowledge to the next generation. Don't wander far from the herd, a tale might warn, or the lions will find you. In the darkness, stories blended with imagination, shaping culture in its earliest form. Life wasn't easy. Frostbite, hunger, predators, each step into the snow carried risk. But humans adapted. They followed herds, used rivers as landmarks, and mapped the land not with ink, but with memory. They worked together. They experimented. And slowly they began to thrive, not in spite of the cold, but because they understood it. And they weren't alone. Other humans, Neanderthals, shared the same frozen landscapes for a time. Stockier, stronger, just as skilled at survival. They too built shelters, hunted, and warmed themselves by fire. Sometimes they competed with modern humans, sometimes they mingled. Their lives touched, and traces of those connections still echo in our DNA today. Far from being isolated, the Ice Age world was interconnected in ways we're still discovering. Picture it: a cluster of mammoth bone huts, glowing in the night, smoke rising into the icy air. Inside, families gather around fire sewing hides, with bone needles, carving tools, and telling stories, while the wind rattles the walls. Outside, wolves prowl at the edge of the firelight, their howls mixing with the hiss of the wind. Farther off, mammoths move slowly across the horizon, unaware of the hunters planning their next approach. It's a world both harsh and astonishingly alive. And maybe the most remarkable part is this: humans didn't just survive. They started shaping the Ice Age itself. Every spear, carved every fire, sparked every story told, was a step towards something greater. They were learning to bend the frozen world to their will, one small flame, one stone tool, one painted handprint at a time. By this point, humans in the Ice Age were more than just survivors. They weren't simply chasing herds and hiding from wolves. They were beginning to shape their world with their hands and their imaginations. The story of humanity in this frozen age is not only about enduring, but about creating. Out of stone, bone, and fire came the first sparks of culture, the early foundation of what would someday grow into civilization. Let's talk about tools first. Early humans had been making sharp flakes of stone for hundreds of thousands of years. But by the height of the Ice Age, those tools had become more sophisticated. Picture someone kneeling by a fire, striking a piece of flint with another stone until thin, razor-sharp blades split off. These weren't clumsy chunks. They were fine edges, long and narrow, perfect for cutting meat, scraping hides, or shaping wood. Attach one to a shaft of wood, and suddenly you had a spear, sharp enough to pierce a mammoth's hide. Bone and antler became materials too. With careful carving, they were turned into needles, barbed points, hooks, and even musical instruments. Think about that: someone sitting in a frozen cave, surrounded by snow and danger, takes the time to carve a flute out of bird bone. It's almost funny. In a world of dire wolves and saber-tooths, someone's blowing a tune on the Ice Age version of a recorder, but it tells us something important. Even in harsh times, humans craved more than just survival. They wanted sound rhythm expression. Tools weren't just about efficiency, they were about imagination. To make a spearhead, you had to picture the final shape before you struck the stone. To sew hides into clothes, you had to plan the pieces, think ahead, solve problems. These weren't mindless acts. They were steps toward a kind of thinking that separated humans from every other creature on the steppe. But tools alone don't capture the heart of this story. For that, you have to look at the art. Deep inside, caves far from the daylight, people left paintings that still take our breath away, tens of thousands of years later. Horses, bison, mammoths, reindeer, all drawn with lines of ochre and charcoal. Some simple, others so vivid you can almost feel the movement of the animals. They painted with a sense of grace and detail that seems almost modern. Some caves even show animals drawn with multiple legs, suggesting movement like an early attempt at animation. Disney eat your heart out. Why did they do it? No one knows for sure. Some think the paintings were part of rituals, maybe to bring luck for the hunt. Others think they were teaching tools, a way to show younger hunters what animals looked like and how they moved. Or maybe, just maybe, they painted because they wanted to leave a mark, to say, I was here, I saw this world. Whatever the reason, the art proves something powerful. Even surrounded by ice, humans were reaching beyond survival into imagination. And the creativity didn't stop at walls. They carved small figurines from ivory and stone, animals, humans, and even the mysterious Venus figurines, rounded stylized shapes of the human body. Some see them as fertility symbols, others as spiritual icons. Whatever they were, they speak of minds exploring ideas bigger than food and fire. The Ice Age wasn't just about enduring cold. It was about asking questions, experimenting with meaning, and expressing something deeply human. Let's not forget stories. Picture a group gathered around a fire, the wind rattling the walls of a mammoth bone hut, children curled against their parents, hunters resting from a long day, and one person, maybe an elder, maybe just someone with a knack for words, begins to tell a story. Their voice rises and falls, describing hunts, spirits, dangers, and lessons. The children listen wide-eyed. The adults nod knowingly. These weren't bedtime stories just for fun. They were lessons wrapped in narrative. Don't stray from the herd, or the lions will find you. The river can rise without warning. Watch the clouds. The stories carried knowledge as much as comfort, and yet, woven into those lessons, there must have been wonder too. Myths about the sun and moon, about animals, larger than life, about ancestors whose shadows stretched across generations. In the firelight, imagination turned into culture. If you've ever sat by a campfire and felt the pull of a good story, you've touched the same thread that ran through Ice Age nights. What's striking is how much cooperation all this required. Tools weren't invented in isolation, they were taught. A young hunter learned from watching an elder chip stone. A child learned sewing by sitting beside a parent stitching hides together. Stories pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Nothing was written, but nothing was lost. Memory, practice, and patience were the library of the Ice Age. Now picture this, a cave painted with galloping horses. On the ground, the ashes of a fire still warm. In the corner, a flute carved from bone lies beside spear points and sewing needles. This is culture in its infancy, fragile but undeniable. Humans weren't just reacting to the world, they were shaping it, reflecting on it, and leaving marks that would outlast even glaciers. And maybe here's the most surprising thing. While mammoths, dire wolves, and saber-tooths eventually vanished, these sparks of human culture endured. Fire-making, tool-making, storytelling art, those didn't melt away when the Ice Age ended. They grew multiplied and carried forward into everything that came after. Every song, every story, every sculpture we make today has roots in those caves and fires. The Ice Age wasn't only about cold, it was about the first hints of humanity as we know it. So when you think of the Ice Age, don't just picture shaggy mammoths and walls of ice. Picture someone kneeling with flint striking sparks. Picture another sewing fur into a coat or painting a reindeer deep in a cave. Picture a group listening to a story that makes the dark outside feel just a little less frightening. That was the true miracle of the Ice Age. In the harshest conditions, imaginable humans didn't just survive. They began to imagine. The Ice Age landscape wasn't just about herds of giant grazers or humans sitting snug in their mammoth bone huts. It was also a world stalked by predators, creatures that ruled the frozen plains with claws, teeth, and patience. To live in that world meant sharing every horizon with hunters that could make your day, and a lot earlier than planned. We already met the saber-toothed cats with their dramatic fangs, like something out of a Halloween costume gone wrong. But let's dig deeper into this frozen who's who of danger. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, hearing snow crunch outside your shelter. You peek through the flap of hide, and there it is, a dire wolf bigger than any modern wolf yellow eyes catching the firelight. If your heart just skipped a beat, congratulations, you now know what it felt like to live in the Ice Age. Dire wolves weren't loners. They moved in packs, sometimes dozens, strong trailing herds of bison or mammoths. They had jaws built to crush, bone yes bone, leaving nothing to waste. Their howls echoed across the plains, reminders that you were never really alone. For early humans, those howls weren't just creepy background noise. They were red warning lights, flashing in the dark. Then there were cave lions. These weren't your average lions. Nearly twice the size of today's big cats, they were sleek, powerful, and likely hunted in groups. Picture 6 or 7 of them, fanning out across the snow, their paws barely making a sound, their breath steaming in the cold air. Even mammoths had reason to worry when cave lions worked together. For humans, the thought of stumbling into one of these pride hunts was enough to turn your legs into jelly. And of course, our old friends, the saber-toothed cats, were still around, crouching in the shrubs or along riverbanks, waiting for the perfect moment to lunge. They weren't built for long chases. They were built for ambush. One second, the world looked quiet. The next second, you were starring in their lunch menu. Their teeth weren't just showpieces. They were efficient tools of terror. But predators came in smaller, scrappier forms too. Wolverines, for example. If animals had personality types, the wolverine would be the small guy at the bar who picks a fight with everyone. Fierce, relentless, and willing to steal from animals 10 times their size, wolverines survived by pure audacity. Foxes darted at the edges of hunts grabbing scraps. Overhead, ravens and vultures circled, waiting for someone else to do the hard work before swooping in to clean up. Nothing went to waste in the Ice Age. The moment one life ended, a whole chain of mouths got fed. Now, what did all this mean for humans? Well, it meant they weren't at the top of the food chain, not yet. They were in the middle, negotiating their survival between mammoths on one side and dire wolves on the other. Hunting wasn't just about catching prey, it was about watching your back. A band of humans could spend hours tracking bison only to discover wolves had been following the same trail. Or they might stumble on a half-eaten carcass and realize a saber-tooth wasn't done with dinner. Imagine how nerve-wracking that must have been, basically like ordering takeout only to find a giant cat waiting at the restaurant door. The presence of predators shaped everything humans did. They traveled in groups because numbers meant safety. They kept their fires burning bright, not just for warmth, but to draw a line between themselves and the hungry eyes in the dark. Fire was like a neon sign, flashing, "Don't mess with us," and most predators respected it. But even so, humans had to stay alert. Step 1, keep watch. Step 2, always have a spear, ready. Step 3, if you hear a dire wolf howl, don't go investigate like you're in a horror movie. Stay by the fire. And yet, predators weren't just threats, they were teachers. Competing with wolves and lions forced humans to sharpen their wits. Cooperation became essential. Strategy became survival. Alone, a person didn't stand a chance. Together, humans learned to become rivals even the fiercest predators couldn't ignore. Fire gave them courage. Spears gave them reach. Teamwork gave them power. Slowly, very slowly, they rose from being possible prey to becoming competitors. Still, let's be honest, it was never easy. Predators were part of daily life. Every sound in the night had to be considered. Every shadow on the snow could be danger. You couldn't relax the way we do now, scrolling through your phone while ignoring the outside world. In the Ice Age, ignoring the outside world meant you probably became part of the food chain real quick. But here's the balance. Predators were vital to the ecosystem. They kept the herds in check, prevented overgrazing, and made sure life on the steppe stayed in rhythm. Without them, the world of mammoths and bison would have spun out of balance. Predators weren't villains. They were players in the same game, bound by the same rules of survival. Picture the scene, a herd of bison crossing the snowy plain, breath-steaming hooves thudding. At the edge of the herd, wolves follow tails, low eyes sharp. Farther back, a saber-tooth crouches, muscles twitching. Overhead, vultures circle lazily. And in the distance, a group of humans watches waiting for their moment. Everyone in this picture, predator, prey, or person, depends on everyone else. It's tense, it's dangerous, but it's also balanced. And that's maybe the most important thing to understand. The Ice Age wasn't just cold. It was alive with conflict and cooperation, with risks and rewards. Humans didn't stand above it all. They were in it side by side, with dire wolves and cave lions, learning, adapting, and slowly carving out their place. Predators weren't just dangers in the shadows. They were part of the lessons that shaped us, making sure we grew sharper, faster, and smarter. Without them, we wouldn't be who we are. The Ice Age wasn't only about the northern plains or frozen tundras. Across every continent, the world was bursting with creatures that seem almost mythical today. If you could step into that time, it would feel less like walking through a zoo and more like crashing a parade of giants. Wherever you turned, there was something bigger, stranger, and tougher than anything alive now. On the mammoth steppe, herds of mammoths were only the beginning. Alongside them roamed the woolly rhinoceroses. Imagine a 2-ton tank covered in shaggy fur, with horns so long they looked like medieval lances. They stomped across the grasslands, using their horns to push through snow or fend off predators. Around them, bison grazed in endless lines, heavier and wilder than modern cattle, while muskoxen huddled into defensive circles, presenting a wall of horns to anything foolish enough to approach. Wild horses galloped in tight herds, smaller than today's breeds, but built like little tanks, short, muscular, and fast. Farther south, the story got even stranger. The forests and plains of North and South America held mastodons, stocky cousins of mammoths, who tore bark from trees with their powerful trunks. In the same lands, ground sloths the size of small cars lumbered slowly, their enormous claws digging into roots or ripping down branches. To stand near one of these sloths would have been surreal, like seeing a bear, a tree, and a backhoe combined into one animal. And let's not forget the short-faced bear, taller than any modern bear, long-legged and terrifyingly fast. Imagine running for your life, looking back, and realizing the bear chasing you was gaining ground like an Olympic sprinter. If you ever thought, at least I can outrun a bear, this Ice Age version would have crushed your confidence. Australia had its own cast of megafauna, as if it wanted to prove it could out-weird the rest of the world. There were giant kangaroos that stood taller than professional basketball players, hopping across the plains with thundering strides. Marsupial lions, predators with sharp claws and crushing jaws, prowled the forests. And towering above the landscape were enormous flightless birds, heavier than ostriches, strutting like feathery tanks. To top it off, rivers and swamps hid massive reptiles whose armored bodies hadn't changed much since the age of dinosaurs. If you thought modern Australia was full of dangerous wildlife, its Ice Age version was basically the Nightmare Edition. Even the oceans joined in the party. Lower sea levels meant new coastlines, new hunting grounds, and new marine giants. The Steller's sea cow, an enormous relative of the manatee, grazed peacefully on kelp beds stretching up to 30 feet long. Gentle, slow, and about as threatening as a giant floating potato, they were unfortunately also easy pickings for humans when we finally reached them. And of course, sharks still prowled the deeper waters, reminding everything that the ocean, just like the land, was never entirely safe. What's amazing about this world wasn't just the size of these animals, but how many of them there were. The ecosystems of the Ice Age were unbelievably productive. Grasslands stretched endlessly, feeding herds so large that the ground must have seemed alive with movement. Predators followed in abundance, scavengers swooped in, and the entire web of life thrived on a scale that feels almost impossible today. For humans, stepping into that environment was overwhelming, like trying to live in the middle of a stampede that never really stopped. But size wasn't just about showing off. It was survival strategy. Being massive helped animals keep warm in the cold because large bodies lose heat more slowly. It also helped fend off predators. After all, who really wants to tangle with a woolly rhino or a ground sloth that swings claws like giant meat hooks? Yet being big had downsides too. Giants needed enormous amounts of food. A mammoth could eat hundreds of pounds of vegetation in a single day. A herd could strip a valley bare and then have to march miles to find their next meal. Life for the megafauna was a constant treadmill of eat, move, eat, repeat. For predators, hunting these giants was both opportunity and risk. Bring one down, and your pack could feast for weeks. Fail, and you could end up trampled, gored, or crushed. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and cave lions learned to pick their battles carefully. For humans, hunting giants was even riskier. Spears and teamwork could level the playing field, but one mistake could wipe out an entire hunting party. Still, the reward was worth it. A single mammoth kill meant not just meat, but hides for clothing, bones for shelter, and fat for fuel. What makes this world so fascinating is how dense it was with life. Everywhere you looked, the land moved with creatures. Herds stretched for miles. Predators shadowed them constantly. Scavengers hovered, waiting their turn. Humans were just one more piece in this crowded puzzle, weaving their survival strategies into a world already bursting at the seams. Now picture yourself standing on a ridge overlooking this wild earth. To your left, mammoths march in lines, tusks sweeping the snow. To your right, a herd of bison pounds across the plain, the sound of hooves echoing like thunder. Farther off, a woolly rhino lowers its horn against a pack of wolves. Overhead, vultures and ravens circle their wings, casting shadows on the snow. And at your feet, human hunters crouch, watching it all, deciding when to make their move. It's not a quiet world. It's a roaring, bustling, untamed symphony of survival. And yet, despite its abundance, this world was fragile. The balance depended on the cold. Grasslands thrived because glaciers locked away, water keeping the climate dry and the plains open. Herds flourished because the grass stretched on forever. Predators thrived because prey was plentiful. But when the ice began to retreat, the balance started to tip. Forests crept north, swallowing the plains. Grazing grounds shrank, and for animals built for wide-open grasslands, the walls began to close in. For a time, though, this wilder earth thrived. It was here that humans sharpened their skills, learning to track herds, craft weapons, and push themselves against challenges no other creature faced. The megafauna were more than just neighbors. They were teachers, rivals, and sometimes unwilling providers. Living among them forced humans to adapt in ways that would echo long after the giants were gone. The Ice Age was more than just cold. It was colossal. It gave us a planet where scale itself felt like a force of nature, where size meant survival, and where humans learned to carve out a place in the middle of a living, breathing parade of giants. For tens of thousands of years, the world seemed locked in a frozen grip. The glaciers stretched for miles, the winds howled, and the mammoths trudged across the endless steppe as if nothing would ever change. But deep in the heart of the Ice Age, the first cracks in the cold began to appear. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the earth started to warm. At first, it was subtle. Summers grew just a little longer. Snow that once lingered deep into the year began to melt more completely. Glaciers, which had seemed like eternal monuments of ice, felt the difference first. Their edges softened. Trickles of meltwater ran down their frozen faces, carving little channels that widened with each season. It was like watching a fortress begin to crumble, not with explosions, but with drips. Those drips, however, carried enormous force. As the glaciers melted, the water pooled at their bases, forming rivers that surged across the land. Imagine standing in a valley, hearing a low rumble that turns into a roar as a wall of water bursts free. These glacial outbursts weren't gentle streams. They were tsunamis on land, sweeping away boulders, carving new channels, and drowning entire valleys in hours. Where once there had been silence, there was now thunder. The land itself seemed to gasp as ice loosened its grip. The retreat of the glaciers didn't happen smoothly. It was a stop-and-go process with pauses and reversals. Just when it seemed the world was warming, the cold would return. One of the most dramatic examples was the Younger Dryas, a period about 12,000 years ago, when the climate suddenly snapped back into near glacial conditions. Imagine thinking spring was finally here, flowers blooming, rivers running, and then winter slams the door shut again for over 1,000 years. Talk about a false start. The earth has a sense of humor, but it's not always the kind we enjoy. Still, over the long run, the trend was undeniable. The ice retreated. Valleys once buried beneath glaciers opened to the sun for the first time in tens of thousands of years. The bare ground looked raw, scraped clean, almost lifeless. But life wasted no time reclaiming it. First came mosses and lichens creeping over the exposed stone. Then grasses their roots, holding the soil. Slowly, green threads wove across the gray scars, and soon the land was transformed. What had been frozen wasteland became fertile ground, and where plants went, animals followed. Herds of bison and reindeer ventured onto the new plains. Mammoths and horses grazed the fresh grasses. Predators trailed close behind. Humans, too, pressed forward, tracking the rivers, hunting along the edges of the melting ice. For them, these new lands weren't just scenery, they were opportunity. Ground that had been inaccessible for generations was suddenly open. The frontier expanded, and small bands of people followed the thaw like pioneers chasing spring. But the melting ice was a double-edged sword. Along with new land came chaos. Massive lakes formed where glaciers blocked valleys, held back like giant bathtubs, waiting to overflow. When the ice dams finally broke, the floods were catastrophic. Entire regions were reshaped in days. The Columbia River Gorge in North America, with its towering cliffs and carved valleys, is a direct result of these outbursts. Imagine water rushing so fast it stripped the earth bare, carrying boulders the size of houses, like they were pebbles. If you lived nearby, you didn't just get a bad day, you got an apocalypse. For humans, these floods must have been terrifying. One generation might grow up beside a vast lake, its waters stretching to the horizon. The next might find that same lake gone, replaced by a raw plain, scarred by rushing water. Camps, hunting grounds, entire ways of life could be erased overnight. And yet, as always, humans adapted. They moved, rebuilt, and learned to read the shifting world. If the Ice Age had taught them anything, it was resilience. The seas, too, began to change. As glaciers melted, oceans swelled. Shorelines crept inland, swallowing the coastal plains that had once been highways for humans and animals. Land bridges disappeared beneath the waves. Beringia, the vast tundra that connected Asia to North America, vanished beneath the waters of the Bering Strait. Doggerland, once a broad plain linking Britain to mainland Europe, sank under the North Sea. For the people living there, it must have felt like the earth itself was shrinking, stealing land one tide at a time. But while some lands vanished, others were transformed. Fertile soils, enriched by the minerals scraped from rock and carried by meltwater, became the foundations of future farmlands. The Great Lakes in North America, enormous and deep, filled the scars left by retreating ice. Even today, they hold a fifth of the world's fresh water, a lasting reminder of the Ice Age's slow retreat. Rivers found new paths, wetlands flourished, and ecosystems reshaped themselves around the thaw. What's striking is how quickly change unfolded, not in a human lifetime, but on the scale of generations. For an individual, the world might look stable, the same as it had for their parents. But over centuries, the glaciers shrank, the seas rose, and the earth was transformed. To live in those times was to live in a world that seemed steady, but was secretly shifting beneath your feet. And this shifting world carried consequences for the giants that had once ruled it. The mammoth steppe, that vast grassland of abundance, began to shrink. Forests crept northward, closing off the open plains. Grasses gave way to trees, and for animals built for endless horizons, the world began to feel small. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant bison found themselves pushed into tighter and tighter spaces. Some adapted, but many did not. For humans, though, the warming world brought opportunity. The thaw created fertile valleys, rich rivers, and abundant resources. Hunters followed the herds into new lands, then slowly began to settle, experimenting with plants, domesticating animals, and laying the first stones of a new chapter farming. Without the retreat of the ice, there may never have been wheat in the Middle East, rice in Asia, or corn in the Americas. The end of the Ice Age wasn't just about glaciers melting, it was about humanity stepping into history. So picture it, a glacier towering on the horizon, melting into torrents that roar through valleys. The sun shines on bare ground that hasn't felt warmth in tens of thousands of years. Herds graze cautiously on new grasses. Humans build campfires along rivers that didn't exist a generation ago. And in the distance, the sea creeps quietly inland, reclaiming old highways. It was a world in flux, unpredictable, sometimes violent, but always alive with change. The Ice Age was loosening its grip, but it wasn't going quietly. The melting ice carved the land, drowned the coasts, and tested every creature that depended on it. Some would endure, others would vanish, but nothing, absolutely nothing, would remain the same. As the glaciers melted and the earth grew warmer, it wasn't just the land that changed. The mighty animals that had ruled the Ice Age, the mammoths, the woolly rhinoceroses, the saber-toothed cats, began to fade away. One by one, the giants of the frozen world vanished, leaving behind only bones, frozen remains, and the faint echoes of their time. The first blow came from the climate itself. The mammoth steppe, that sprawling grassland that had once stretched across continents, began to shrink. Forests crept in rivers, swelled, and grasslands fragmented into patches. For animals that needed endless space and miles of grazing ground, this was like shrinking a football field into a living room. Mammoths and woolly rhinos found themselves hemmed in by trees, unable to roam freely or find enough of the grass they depended on. Steppe bison and wild horses faced the same challenge. Predators felt it too. Dire wolves, cave lions, and saber-toothed cats were specialists built for giant prey. When the herds thinned and the plains broke apart, their food supply collapsed. Imagine being a saber-tooth that spent millions of years perfecting the art of ambush, only to discover the buffet had closed, and all that was left were smaller, faster meals. Survival got harder with every passing season, but climate wasn't the only pressure. Another force was spreading across the globe: humans. By the end of the Ice Age, humans had sharpened their tools, mastered fire, and learned to cooperate in ways predators never could. Armed with stone-tipped spears and strategies passed down through stories, they became some of the most dangerous hunters the world had ever seen. A single mammoth could feed an entire band for weeks. Its bones provided shelter frames, its hide became clothing, and its fat burned bright in the fire. For people living in a harsh, unpredictable world, mammoths weren't just animals, they were survival kits on four legs. But with every hunt, the herds grew smaller. What once had been rare, dangerous, and almost impossible became more common. Human skill grew mammoth. Numbers shrank. Some scientists argue about which mattered more, climate change or hunting, but most agree it was the deadly combination of both. The giants were already under stress from shrinking habitats. Humans pushed them past the breaking point. Imagine trying to juggle while someone keeps adding balls. At some point, everything falls. For the mammoths, rhinos, and saber-toothed, that point came at the end of the Ice Age. The evidence of this extinction is written across the globe. In Siberia, frozen mammoths have been found with spear wounds in their bones. In North America, kill sites reveal piles of mammoth skeletons, stripped of meat, their bones cracked open for marrow. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate hunts, organized and efficient. And while each hunt gave humans life, it also brought the giants closer to death. Yet not all vanished at once. Extinction came in waves. In Australia, many of the marsupial giants disappeared long before the northern glaciers melted. In the Americas, mammoths and saber-tooths held on until about 10,000 years ago before finally vanishing. In some places, small populations managed to hang on, cut off from the wider world. On Wrangel Island in the Arctic, mammoths survived thousands of years longer than their mainland cousins. Isolated by rising seas, they shrank in size, dwindled in number, but endured in quiet persistence until just a few thousand years ago. Imagine that while the pyramids of Egypt were being built, tiny mammoths were still trudging across a lonely island, the last echoes of their kind. For humans, the disappearance of the giants was both a loss and a turning point. On one hand, the world grew emptier, quieter, stripped of creatures that had once defined it. On the other, humans no longer had to compete with dire wolves or cave lions for survival. The playing field had changed. The Ice Age ended not just in melting glaciers, but in a quieter earth where humans were suddenly without rivals. The extinction of the megafauna cleared the way for humans to become the dominant species on land. But let's pause for a second. It's tempting to see this as a triumph, but it's also a reminder. The giants were here for millions of years. They endured swings of climate advances, of ice, and countless challenges. And yet, in just a few thousand years of human expansion, they were gone. That's how powerful humans had become, not in numbers at first, but in ingenuity. Fire tools, cooperation, those simple things gave us the leverage to reshape the world. Standing in the shadow of a retreating glacier, watching mammoths graze in the distance, our ancestors probably didn't realize they were witnessing the twilight of giants. For them, it was just life, hard, cold, and full of risk. But for us, looking back, it's a sobering reminder of how fragile abundance can be. The Ice Age felt eternal, but in the end, even mammoths couldn't outlast change. Picture it, a mammoth herd moving slowly across the tundra, calves trotting between their mothers, tusks glinting in the low sun. In the distance, hunters crouch their spears ready. The cold wind cuts across the plain, carrying with it the sound of wolves. Above, vultures circle, already anticipating the outcome. It's a scene filled with tension, beauty, and inevitability. Within a few short millennia, it would vanish forever. The extinction of the giants wasn't just the end of an era, it was the beginning of a new one. With the mammoth steppe fading, with predators gone, and forests spreading, humans were left in a world they could shape more directly. Farming settlements, and eventually cities, grew from the spaces the giants left behind. The Ice Age didn't just end with melting ice. It ended with humans stepping into the spotlight, ready or not. When the last of the great glaciers finally began to retreat, the Earth transformed in ways that must have been shocking for anyone alive to see it. After thousands of years of white horizons, the sharp edges carved by the ice softened. Rivers swelled with meltwater lakes, shimmered in fresh valleys, and slowly but surely the land turned from pale to green. The frozen planet was giving way to something new, a warmer, softer world that looked far more like the one we live in today. At first, it wasn't dramatic. No sudden burst of jungle or Hollywood-style montage of forests popping up overnight. It started with mosses creeping across bare stone lichens, gripping cracks, and tiny shoots of grass pushing through fresh soil. These pioneers of life were tough little plants, the kind you'd normally ignore on a hike today. But in that moment, they were superheroes. They took root in the scars left behind by the glaciers, slowly transforming gray emptiness into living ground. Then came the trees. Birch and pine were among the first to march northward. Hardy, stubborn, and able to handle cold conditions, they spread across the newly thawed land, like nature's version of squatters. After them came oak, elm, and other broadleaf trees, and suddenly the open plains that had once fed mammoths and bison were shaded by forests. Imagine being a hunter, returning to the same valley your grandparents once described as endless grassland, only to find it filled with trees and birdsong. It must have felt like the earth had pulled off the ultimate home makeover. With the forests came new animals. Deer slipped through the trees, their antlers weaving between branches. Wild boar rooted noisily in the underbrush. Smaller grazers that could live in tighter spaces thrived, while the great herds of mammoths and rhinos dwindled. Wolves, once hunters of vast plains, adapted to stalking in the shadows of the trees. Foxes, lynxes, and bears flourished in this shifting landscape. The food chain was rewriting itself, and humanity was adapting right along with it. For humans, this new world was both blessing and challenge. The forests offered more diverse food sources, nuts, berries, fish in the swollen rivers, but hunting large prey became harder. You couldn't just scan the horizon for a herd anymore. You had to track animals in thick woods where visibility was poor and ambushes could go both ways. This pushed humans to innovate. Spears were still useful, but bows and arrows began to emerge, perfect for hunting in the clutter of trees. Rivers born from glacial melt became lifelines. They provided fish fresh water and travel routes. Wetlands formed in the hollows left behind by ice, attracting birds and small game. If the Ice Age had taught people how to survive with grit. This new age was teaching them how to thrive with variety. They didn't just follow the herds anymore. They lingered near rivers and valleys, experimenting with plants, learning which seeds sprouted and which ones fed them best. This was the hesitant dawn of farming. But life in this greener world wasn't necessarily easier. Forests hid predators just as much as they hid prey. Imagine creeping quietly through a stand of birch bough in hand only to realize a bear was doing the same thing, but in your direction. The risks didn't vanish, they just changed. The Ice Age may have loosened its grip, but danger still lurked behind every rustling branch. Meanwhile, the seas were creeping higher. As the glaciers melted, oceans swallowed coastal plains that had once been home to humans and animals alike. Doggerland, the fertile plain that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, vanished beneath the rising North Sea. For the people living there, it must have felt like the land itself was betraying them, disappearing bit by bit into the waves. Generations could grow up by the shore, only to see their children forced inland as the water advanced. And yet humanity did what it always does, adapted. Some groups followed the retreating forests and rivers inland. Others learned to harvest the bounty of the coast, fishing, gathering shellfish, and turning the rising seas into opportunity. Instead of resisting change, they leaned into it, discovering new ways to live. The rhythm of life also shifted. The Ice Age had been extreme, long, bitter winters and short, frantic summers. Now the seasons grew more balanced. Spring stretched out. Summers were milder. Winters, though still cold, weren't as merciless. This gave humans a new stability. They could begin to predict the world in ways their Ice Age ancestors never could. And with that stability came the possibility of staying in one place longer, of planting seeds and returning to harvest them. The transformation was not only physical, it was cultural. With time freed up from endless migration, humans began to gather in larger groups. Villages formed. Stories stretched further than survival. Art flourished. The walls of caves gave way to carvings, ornaments, and eventually monuments. The Ice Age had forged resilience. The new world Nim was shaping imagination. But even as the earth turned green, it carried scars of its frozen past. Valleys carved by glaciers remained. Boulders stranded by ice stood as silent monuments. Lakes filled the deep gouges left behind. The fingerprints of the Ice Age were everywhere, even as the forests spread to cover them. And in the far north, the tundra remained a stubborn reminder that winter still had territory to claim. So imagine standing in this changing world. Behind you, the horizon still holds glimmers of ice, ancient and blue. Before you, a forest stretches, alive with birdsong, the air rich with the scent of pine. A river sparkles where once a glacier ground the rock. At your feet, green shoots push through the soil. It is no longer a world of giants and endless plains. It is a world of balanced softness and promise. The Ice Age wasn't just ending, it was evolving. And in that evolution, humans weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to shape the world themselves. Even after the glaciers retreated and forests marched north, the Ice Age never really disappeared. Its fingerprints were everywhere, etched into stone water soil and even into us. The frozen world had ended, but it left behind echoes that still shape the way we live today. Start with the land. Across North America and Europe, Valleys with U-shaped bottoms still bear the unmistakable signature of ice. Rivers carve V-shaped valleys narrow and steep. But glaciers, they bulldozed everything in their path, leaving wide troughs with flat floors and towering walls. Hike through places like Yosemite or the fjords of Norway, and you're walking in the shadow of glaciers that melted thousands of years ago. The landscape itself is like a photo album of the Ice Age, except instead of pictures, you get cliffs, lakes, and rocks the size of houses, casually sitting in fields where no mountain exists to explain them. Those boulders called glacial erratics are among the strangest leftovers. Imagine strolling through farmland in northern Europe, and there's a massive stone the size of a truck just there, no mountain nearby, no cliff it could have fallen from. It's like nature decided to play surprise furniture delivery. The truth is simpler, but more impressive glaciers carried them for hundreds of miles, then dropped them like forgotten luggage when the ice melted. They're monuments to journeys longer than anything humans had attempted at the time. Then there are the lakes, the Great Lakes in North America, the Finger Lakes in New York, even the countless small ones scattered across Scandinavia, all carved by glaciers grinding into bedrock, then filled with meltwater. These lakes aren't just pretty scenery. They're giant reminders of an age when ice was the sculptor-in-chief chiseling out the earth we walk on. Today, they provide drinking water, transportation routes, and fish connecting modern life directly to ancient ice. But the most delicate echoes of the Ice Age are hidden in places we can't see with our own eyes. Deep beneath Greenland and Antarctica lie frozen archives of history. Layers of ice compacted over hundreds of thousands of years trap tiny bubbles of ancient air. Scientists drill into them, pulling up cores that read like diaries of the earth. Inside, you find the exact makeup of the atmosphere long before humans built cities. It's like nature kept receipts just in case we ever wanted to check what the air was like 100,000 years ago. Spoiler, there was a lot less carbon dioxide back then. Other traces lie in the soil. Lowest plains, vast blankets of fine dust blown by Ice Age. Winds stretch across China, Europe, and North America. These deposits are so fertile that today they feed millions through farming. Imagine that every loaf of bread or bowl of noodles from those regions carries a silent signature of the Ice Age. It's like mammoths indirectly helped invent pasta. And then, of course, there are the bones. Frozen mammoths emerge from Siberian permafrost with their fur still intact, as if they'd just taken a nap. In caves across Europe, skulls of dire wolves and saber-toothed cats lie buried in sediment, waiting to be rediscovered. Some are so well preserved that you can still see the marks of human tools on their bones. Each fossil is not just a remnant, but a story one that links us to the giants we once shared the earth with. But the Ice Age left more than landscapes and relics. It shaped us. Our ancestors migrated across land bridges, exposed by low seas, following herds across continents. Those journeys spread humans to every corner of the globe. The skills they learned, fire making, tool shaping, cooperation, were honed in the crucible of the Ice Age. Without the cold pressing down, forcing innovation, we might never have become who we are. Even today, animals echo that time. Bison still roam the plains of North America, though in smaller herds. Musk oxen, shaggy and unyielding, stand defiant in the Arctic tundra. Reindeer still follow ancient migration routes that date back to the mammoth steppe. Each one is a living fragment of that frozen past. Our very climate still bears the imprint of ice, the patterns of winds, the courses of rivers, even the slow rebound of the Earth's crust where glaciers once pressed it down. All of these are legacies still unfolding. In Scandinavia and Canada, the land is literally rising millimeter by millimeter, shaking off the weight of glaciers that melted thousands of years ago. The Earth is still adjusting as if it can't quite believe the Ice Age is over. And perhaps the most striking echo of all is the lesson it left behind. The world can change dramatically and quickly in ways that reshape everything. Giants can vanish, seas can rise, forests can replace plains. For people living in modern times, it's easy to think the world is stable, unshakable. But the Ice Age whispers otherwise. It reminds us that stability is temporary, that change is the one constant written into the earth itself. So next time you stand on a windy plain, or walk beside a glacial lake, or feel the sting of winter air, remember you are brushing against the past. You are walking through the legacy of an age when the earth was colder, wilder, and full of creatures we can barely imagine. The Ice Age didn't just end. It stayed with us in stone, in water, in air, and in memory. And if you're quiet enough, maybe just maybe you can still hear it. A faint echo of ice cracking, of mammoths moving across the snow, of winds carrying dust across a frozen world. The Ice Age is gone, but its story never really left.